I'm going to talk today about climate responsibility and new cultures of consumption. As Ellis mentioned, the work that I'm talking about today comes from my most recent book, which was called Plenitude in the original hardback, and the publisher was not happy with the volume of sales and thought that maybe retitling it would be a good idea for the paperback. So if you're interested in finding it, it's called True Wealth: How and Why Millions of Americans Are Creating a Time-Rich, Ecologically Light, Small-Scale, High-Satisfaction Economy. And occasionally I'll refer to this idea of the plenitude model, and I'll be talking about some of that model today, but it is sort of this new kind of economy which does those things that the subtitle tells you about. And today I'm going to focus mostly on the new ways to work and consume in a carbon-constrained world. And the sort of big point is the following, which is that in what I call in the book the business as usual economy, taking that term from the climate discourse, in a business as usual world, if we want to solve unemployment problems, typically the solution to that is to try and rev up the economy, make it grow faster. But that creates a lot more carbon emissions and ecological degradation. Similarly, our approaches to environmental protection have typically been, or many of them have been, wall off some land, conserve some resources, don't engage in economic activity. So there's typically thought to be a trade-off between protecting the environment and jobs. And that's the dominant framing that I would say most Americans have, and certainly our president has, because when he was asked right after he was inaugurated, what are you going to do on climate? Are you going to have something to deal with carbon emissions? He said, well, the American people won't stand for it if it means reducing jobs and economic growth. If we can find a way to deal with climate that doesn't do that, then I'll do it. So he put himself squarely in that trade-off formulation. What I want to argue today is that we've got to get out both of the mentalities that say there's a trade-off between these two things and the sort of policy boxes, the constrained thinking and constrained menus of options that we are talking about in this country to talk about some new kinds of economies, new ways of working, new ways of using time, new cultures of consumption that allow us to transcend that trade-off and that actually, I think, will make us both better off and allow us to act ethically with respect to our what should be our commitments on climate. So, first point, and I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on this, we are in a warming world. Climate change is here. We are just at the beginning of this. We need to act to stop runaway climate change. And I think we can do it. But we already have significant evidence of temperature increase. We broke tens and tens of thousands of temperature records last year, 2012. Warmest year on record here in the United States. You may remember the winter that wasn't 2012, how warm it was, 80-degree weather in March. July was, broke thousands of temperature records around the country. Globally, we are in a world of rising emissions. So we have been talking about climate change really since the 1970s, when there was first public awareness of climate change, and yet we have been unable to cope with global emissions in terms of making a shift toward reduced emissions. Here we have some of the evidence of climate change beyond temperature, but some of the kinds of effects that come from rising temperatures. This is the extent of Arctic sea ice, and of course we had and these are observations, and these are the models. So you can see that the models are doing pretty well here in this first period between 1960 and the present. doing pretty well in predicting what's happening with the ice, although there have been a lot of surprises. You may remember last summer there was a 4-day period when that Greenland ice sheet just pretty much disappeared. I think it was 94% of it gone, or 97%, I don't remember the exact number. So we're now looking at situations of Arctic sea melt, ice melt, far beyond what scientists were thinking. And there was just a paper that came out, I think, yesterday on sea-free or ice-free summers. We are dealing already with drought. Last summer, we had over 60% of the country's counties in serious drought conditions comparable to what we had in the 1930s. This is a diagram that's predicting the amount of drought we're going to have in the decade of the 2060s. And here you see this is dry, that's wet. Sorry, that got cut off. The redder you get, the more purple you get down here. So you can see that parts of our country, like the middle of our country, is slated for really strong drought conditions. And these areas here indicate, quite severe drought. And take a look at this absolutely phenomenal part of the world. If any of you have been to places like Tuscany or Spain or Northern Africa, and you can see this whole area, which is dry to begin with, the Mediterranean area, is going to be under these really strong, very severe drought conditions. The purple areas being the super drought, and of course Central America. So we're in for some really strong changes if we don't respond, and we're going to have changes no matter what we do, but things are going to get really severe if we don't make some pretty rapid changes. So this is a map which looks at who's emitting, and the more you emit, the bigger your part of the world is, and this helps us to see something about the issue of ethical responsibility, because we can see a couple of parts of the world that are doing a lot of emitting. The countries that you're hearing a lot about these days, India and China. I'll have more to say about them. The U.S., a very big emitter. But take a look at places like Latin America, Africa. That's a huge landmass, but it's a small emitter. Here's Australia, which is a place that has very little population. It's a pretty big emitter. And then also these more southern parts, that Mediterranean area that I just showed you, not such a big emitter, but there's going to be a very big impact there with drought. And one of the things that we can see from here, these tropical areas, let's say these two continents, are going to bear the brunt of climate change. And yet, you look at that small contribution that they're making relative to some of the other parts of the world. Now, one of the things that looking at emissions in this way doesn't factor in is population. And that's really important for thinking about ethical implications. And so let's talk about that. There's a lot of talk about China and India and the problem of China and India. China now being a bigger emitter than the United States. India coming up with rapid increases in its carbon emissions. And both these things are true. These are countries who are emitting a lot of carbon, and their increase in carbon emissions is high compared to ours. But let's look on a per capita basis, because the U.S. is 300 million people, give or take. China's over 1 billion. India's over 1 billion. These are countries that are much bigger than we are in population terms. So this is a typo, I'm sorry, it should be per capita. Tons of equivalent carbon emissions. So that's both carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases converted to carbon equivalents. The U.S. here is the outlier with the biggest per capita emissions. Let's compare it. Here's a really interesting comparison. A country like Germany, which is, here's the Germans. They're at 4, we're at over 6. The Germans have a really wealthy standard of living. If any of you have been to Germany, it's a really rich country. In fact, when you go there, that's one of the things that you kind of most notice is how rich it is. So they have a really high standard of living, and yet they emit much, much less than we do on a per-person basis. And pretty much across Europe, with the exception of one or two countries, you have countries with comparable standards of living in material terms. So they're as rich as we are. Their GDP per capita isn't all that different. And yet many of them are at half the carbon emissions that we are. So we have a very wasteful standard of living in terms of product per energy use. And there are a number of reasons for that. It's partly the kinds of things that we consume, but it's also because we just consume very wastefully. So in Germany, for example, building codes are really different. So they use a lot less energy to heat their buildings. They can stay as warm as we do, but they use a lot less electricity than we do. So they drive cars less. They have better public transportation. So there are a number of things that they do to get well-being from their dollars in a way that uses a lot less energy. And that's pretty much true across Western Europe. So if we think about, well, how can we reduce our carbon emissions and yet still have a good life? There's a big swath of that we can do without really cutting into how affluent we are in a certain sense. No, we're going to have to do more than that. But I do want to take a look at these two countries down here, India and China, which on a per capita basis are at a small fraction of the carbon emissions that we are using. So all that finger pointing and sort of China bashing in the debate has to always be counterbalanced in our mind by the fact that, there's a way in which that's a political designation, country, nation. A lot more people in that country than in ours, and the idea that we should just be thinking of countries as equivalent without thinking about their population and their size, I think is really important. And a lot of the climate debate has not taken population into account. It has talked on a national, international basis. And there's also what we call the carbon legacy. So it may be the case that China is emitting more carbon than we are today. That's true, they are. But it's also the case that if you look at where all that carbon in the atmosphere came from, China has had a pretty small impact on filling up the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. The US has had a really big impact. So this is the United States, which over the period 1750 to 2006 contributed 27.7%. That is an artificially exact number, I should tell you, because of course these are estimates, so I don't know, 28%. 28% of all the accumulated CO2 and CO2 equivalents in the atmosphere came from us. Now we're a population, we're 4.5% of the world's population, so we have an outsized responsibility on the carbon legacy front, that is the carbon that's already up there. We put more carbon up there than any other country in the world. Here is India with 2.5%, China with 8.4%. It'll be a little bit higher now. You've got you take Russia out here and Germany, which is a fairly large one, but the rest of Europe is only 18%. Rest of world only 13%. There's the UK. So we bear a special responsibility in terms of climate change because we are the biggest legacy producer, and of large countries, we are the biggest per capita producer. And I think we bear another kind of responsibility because we're such an important country politically in the world, and what we do matters so much, and there isn't going to be a global solution unless we as a country can step up and lead on climate, as people are now talking about. So this is the perspective I'm starting from, thinking about what is our responsibility, what is our legacy as a country in terms of this problem, what do we need to do about it. The positive thing is that in the last few years, our emissions have finally started to decline. And that is in large part, not only, but the two big dimensions to that. One is the recession. So since 2007, our economic growth has slowed down a lot, and that drives carbon emissions to a large extent. So we have been having significant, not as big as they need to be, but important reductions. And then, of course, the moving off of coal. Now, which has been really important because coal is such a carbon-intensive fuel. Now, some of that is moving into natural gas, some of which is hydraulically fractured, or fracked as it's called. And there are climate impacts to that gas that have not yet been taken into account. In particular, there's a lot of methane produced with fracking. And so much of the debate has been about carbon. So some of this may turn out to be a little bit illusory as we get a better handle on the methane. So it's not, the gas story looks better than it really is, and we can talk more about that. Last point I want to make on ethical issues is just to remind ourselves that climate change is not just a problem of the future, as it has been talked about, I think, until quite recently. I think we are finally now talking about climate change as something that is an issue of both the present and the future. And this is looking at already the estimated deaths attributed to climate change in the year 2000 by subregion. So going from green to red gets you more deaths. And this point I wanted to make, similar kind of point to the one I made earlier about emissions coming from global north and wealthy countries disproportionately, consequences being felt disproportionately in poorer global south countries. And I do think this is important in why we have failed to address climate change, why we are still having a debate about whether climate change exists, why we have such a vibrant climate change denier industry, and why our fossil fuel industries are still so powerful. Because we are causing a problem that is going to be disproportionately borne by other people. And those are poor people, those are people of color, those are people in places like Africa and India, West Asia here, and parts of Latin America as well. And that's a part of this conversation that we don't hear enough about in this country. If you go to global south countries, you hear more about that. But it's if we're thinking about the ethical issues associated with climate change, absolutely central. So we've got to get on a path to 350 parts per million. That is the rate of atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases that scientists increasingly have begun to focus on as what we need to get to stop, not to stop climate change, to stop runaway climate change. And one of the things that means, if you look at this as a path from a model of how you get down to 350, what has to happen to emissions by the year 2050, that we, the Annex I countries, meaning the global north countries, the wealthy countries, really need to start getting those emissions reductions locked in place and accelerating, because by 2050 we've got to be at probably 90% reduction in our emissions, and that's a task that means we've got to have more than 1-2% a year, which is pretty much what we've been experiencing in recent years. The global south countries, the non-annex ones, are also going to have to start reducing, and pretty soon. So even if we can say it's not sort of ethically fair, they're big enough, China and India especially are big enough that they're also going to have to start reducing. And that, for them I think is unfair that we got to develop with cheap fossil fuel energy, which is like a magic elixir from the point of view of what it does for, how valuable it is in economic development. And they're going to be forced onto a path, an energy path, which is going to be much more expensive harder energy to, at least unless there's some amazing breakthroughs. So in thinking about the economics of this and sort of what is a model that would allow us to respond to the climate challenge and would allow us to reduce our emissions really significantly, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, can we keep trying to expand the size of our economy? And there's a vibrant debate going on now about this question, which started not just about climate change, but which started about ecological limits as a whole. And it went by the term of the limits to growth, which was the name of a book that came out in the 1970s by some modelers at MIT who sort of were modeling the systems of the Earth: population, industrial production, ecosystems, resources. And they said, we are overusing the resources of the Earth, and if we keep growing both in population and industrial production the way we are, and they published this book in 1972, by the first decade of the 21st century, there's going to be some collapse happening. There are going to be some really serious problems besetting the system. And the economists all said poo to that these people didn't know what they were talking about. Scientists, by and large, signed on to the idea that you can't have infinite growth in a finite world, which is a pretty, from a biophysical point of view, it's a pretty irrefutable point. You can't have infinite growth in a finite world. The economists came back and said, well, you can have infinite growth in money, which is just a mental construct in a way. So the economy could grow, in value terms could grow infinitely, although it can't grow in resource terms infinitely. And this debate came to be known as the decoupling debate, because what the economists were saying was, well, you can decouple the GDP from actual resources so that your economy could grow, but the resources that it needs to grow could be shrinking. And that was called decoupling, and the scientists said, it's wishful thinking, that you're not going to be able to decouple the size of your economy completely from resources, and that's certainly not in any relevant time frame. And so there's been a lot of debate about that, and this is a graph that asks that question about decoupling. And it turns out, so what decoupling means is there less resource use, and here we're talking about carbon. So this is growth in CO2 emissions from the production side of the economy rather than the consumption side. So how much are your factories and households and so forth producing over 1991 to 2007? Now, there are a few countries that didn't get any decoupling, so that meant their economies actually got less efficient in terms of the amount of CO2 production for each dollar of GDP. Because down here you have growth in GDP. So countries that are in here did what we call relative decoupling, meaning for every dollar of GDP, they're using they're generating fewer CO2 emissions. So, some of them did some of this. Now, China didn't do too much. You can see here, it had really high GDP growth, and it had really high CO2 growth because it was just burning a lot of coal basically until pretty recently as they start to shift into some alternatives. These other countries around here, we're a little bit inside this line. Here's the USA, meaning we're doing a little bit of decoupling. But it turns out, so that's the relative decoupling. So you're still increasing your emissions, but not by as much as your GDP. So, here we are, the United States, so we're here at, say, about 25% increase, but our GDP went up by about 75%. And in fact, we were reducing our carbon emissions per dollar of GDP over this period by about 1.2% a year. So a little bit of progress, but not a huge amount. There are a couple of countries which actually managed to do what we call, which is real decoupling or absolute decoupling, meaning they were getting reductions in their CO2 emissions, which is what has to happen. Now, the Russians did it, but they did it because their economy collapsed. So they are not an example of being able to decouple within the conventional economic model. So they had negative growth in GDP, or here it's zero, no growth in GDP. And there are a bunch of other countries that we know. You can see, if your economy collapses, your CO2 goes down. That's not a feasible way to do it, obviously. It creates a lot of pain. The Germans are the most interesting because they had the biggest decoupling. So they've had, kind of here, we're looking at maybe about a 20% reduction. And yet they had, a little bit more than that in terms of increase in GDP. So they were able to expand their economy at the same time that they reduced their carbon emissions. Great Britain and France, a little bit less of a great story. So they did a little bit of decoupling. If you count the emissions they outsourced to China and to Eastern Europe, because this is production-based, so it's only what's being produced in your country. If you count those, they're over the line. So they're not really true decouplers. And the United States, by the way, would look a lot worse if we counted in those emissions from China, because about 20% of our emissions are being outsourced to China and coming back to us in the form of the products that we're buying from China. About 40% of China's CO2 emissions are coming in production for export. And we can ask the question, who should be responsible for that, the producers or the consumers? I think there's a good argument that the consumers should be responsible for it. But the key point I want to make here about this graph is that the few countries that were able to decouple were not able to do it with very much GDP growth. So they did experience that trade-off between sort of getting real progress on emissions. They were slow growers. And yet, they're really, particularly France and Germany, they're wealthy countries whose economies performed reasonably well during this time period. And I'm going to show you why and how we might be able to move on a trajectory that would allow us to maintain well-being at the same time that we slow down that GDP growth and get those emission reductions that we need. The key to it has to do with our hours of work. Both Germany and France had very significant reductions in the hours of work per person and hours of work per worker over this period of time. What they did was they took their productivity growth, which is substantial in both countries, they took their productivity growth and instead of using it to produce a lot more stuff, they used it to give themselves more free time off. They weren't taking income away from people. They just weren't growing at the fastest rate that they might have if they'd tried to plow back every last bit of productivity growth into increasing. And what I have found, and this is just a 2x2 looking at ecological footprint, which is carbon footprint is the biggest part of it, but I've also done it for carbon footprint, is that countries who have shorter hours of work have lower eco footprints, lower carbon footprints, and lower carbon emissions. Countries that have longer hours of work pollute more. And one of the reasons our carbon footprint is so high is because we have very high hours of work compared to all the other wealthy countries. And let's take a look at that. So between 1870 and 1970, these are the 6 early industrializing countries. All of them experienced huge declines in hours of work. So in 1870, the average work week in these countries was about 60 hours a week. That makes 3,000 hours on an annual basis. And that's what you see over here, hours worked per person per year. So we're all at about 3,000. Another one of those fake exactitude numbers that these are estimates. So they're roughly speaking, we don't know exactly what hours of work were in 1870, but they were about that. These are figures from the economic historian Angus Maddison. Notice what happened. Every one of these countries had a really significant decline over the next 100 years. They all grew, and some of them grew really rapidly, but none of them grew as fast as they could have had they taken all their productivity growth and put it into more expansion. All of them had significant declines in hours of work. All of them gave their citizens more free time over this period. So the work week went down from a 60-hour work week to below a 40-hour work week on average. And the United States, which in this one is the blue line here, the United States was the leader in this. We were the first to get Sundays off. We were the first to get Saturdays off. We were the first to reduce the working day, to get working hour legislation. So we were the leader in work time reduction over this period. And I want to mention that because we are thought of today as the workaholic nation, as a country where you can never reduce working hours because American work ethic is so strong and so forth. And that's a very recent phenomenon in terms of how we compare to other industrialized countries, because we've been out ahead on work time until after the Second World War and into the 1970s. That's when you really start to see a divergence. So I apologize, the colors changed on this one. Here we are, we're the yellow line. All of these other countries began reducing working hours. Even Japan, which, when I wrote The Overworked American, was the big workaholic nation, even Japan has come down and no longer has longer working hours than we do. But look at the big difference between us and all these other countries here. We have flatlined using these data. These are data from employers. We have stopped reducing working hours. All of these competitor countries have continued to reduce working hours, so that you have a really big gap between, say, France and Germany, those two countries that did well on CO2 emissions, and the U.S., where they're at about 1,400 here, and now they're even a little bit below it. Some of them are, the Dutch now are below the 1,400, as are the Germans, and we're still up here at 1,800. If you look, this is data from employers. If you look on a per person basis and ask individuals how many hours are they working, we actually had a very significant increase in working time over this period, because that will include multiple job holdings, so second jobs and third jobs, work that isn't being counted because it's being done at home, work that the employers are not, work that's salaried workers are doing that isn't being counted by employers because they're sort of officially on a 40-hour schedule or something. So we stopped reducing our working hours, and that's really crucial. It's at the core of the plenitude model, which says if you want to reduce carbon emissions, you've got to do something about working hours. You've got to start channeling productivity into shorter hours of work. If you do, you're going to get some benefits. You're going to get lower CO2 emissions. People are going to have more free time, and we have a lot of overstressed people. And you can also be able to do something about unemployment, because one of the reasons our unemployment is so high compared to European unemployment is that our hours of work are so high. And that means that for every job an American employer wants to create, they've got to generate that much more revenue, because it's got to cover that many more hours. And that's almost up to about 20% more revenue compared to the lowest hours country in Europe, the Dutch and the Germans, and to some extent the French. The French also had a famous working hour reduction about 10 years ago. So these are what happened on an annual or on a household basis to hours of work, which went up by about 200 hours before the downturn. So that's the kind of macro thing that we need to deal with, and I'm happy to talk in the questions about how you could actually do that. But let me move on to the sort of next question that may be in your mind, which is, well, okay, let's say we managed to do what you're talking about, that we managed to get on the same kind of trajectory that the Europeans are on, that our working hours were declining, that our incomes were more or less stabilizing. So if we took all of our productivity growth in the form of shorter hours of work, we wouldn't be getting growing incomes, we'd be getting growing free time. I mean, you could allocate some to each, but let's just take the polar case of we're going to, do the maximal hours reductions. So we're going to kind of flatline our incomes instead of flatlining our hours of work. what does that mean? How would people live? Is it possible? Would people even accept that? And what does it mean for consuming? And how does carbon emissions come into that? So I think the answer to that is to look at the flip side of those long hours of work, and the flip side of that is high-intensity consumption, or what some people have called hyperconsumption. But we've gone for a much more sort of consumer path, and I call it, looking at the last 15, 20 years or so forth, the fast fashion era. And apparel is a great case because it's sort of the leading case of this fast fashion model, meaning increased acquisition, and then it turns out not just acquisition, discard. If I put a little bubble here, what would it say? I think what she's thinking is, I don't have a thing to wear. So, I mean, this is a great example also of paradox of choice, which psychologists talks about. The more choice you have, the more paralyzed you are. So anyway, that's the sort of sums it up in terms of the apparel story. Sorry, double slide. Consumption needs to change as well. Well, I've calculated how we got to that scene of that young woman in a room surrounded by hundreds of garments. And part of what happened is that over time, Americans began to buy more and more and more and more new garments. And between 1991 and 2007, they doubled the number of new garments that they bought each year. Each year, yep. So that by the end of this period, the average person in America, the average adult, was buying 67 new pieces of apparel a year, which is about 5.4, every 5.4 days, a new piece of clothing. And that's a lot. And I know, especially when I go to the Midwest and people hear a statistic like that, they're absolutely flabbergasted. And we don't think of ourselves as consuming that many or purchasing that many, but that's actually what the numbers show. They also show something else that I think is quite interesting, which is the more we buy, and now this is almost all in the form of imports, 97% of our apparel consumption is imported. So we have almost no domestic apparel consumption, just a little bit of highly specialized technical and uniform kind of clothing. The more we import, the more we then export in the form of secondhand clothing. And so this is used apparel exports from the U.S. to the rest of the world. So you see that zooming up as all those new clothes we bought get given out to Goodwill and Planet Aid and all the other charitable organizations, which then sell them to wholesalers, and they get resold in poor countries around the world. And my own model shows that the more we import, the more we export, and it's a really close connection. Now, we also throw a lot away. So we're not just exporting clothing. The stuff that's a little more beat up gets thrown into the household waste stream. And it turns out that this story of rising consumption and rising discard, because you can also think of it, this is household discard. That's where that, it goes through those charitable organizations and so forth. Rising consumption and rising discard is true not just for apparel, it's also true for electronics. It's true for furniture. Our per capita increase in the amount of furniture, both the numbers of units or the weight of the furniture that we're buying, increased by about 150% over this period, late 90s to right before 2007, the last year before the boom. It's true for footwear, a little bit less true for footwear. It's true for ceramics. It's true for glassware. It's true for sporting equipment. It's true for musical instruments. It's true for pretty much everything across the manufacturing sector. All of these durable, these material consumer goods, we bought a lot more of them and we discarded more of them. And the cheap imports was a big part of that. But it's also a cultural change that went on in which people were kind of churning these goods, buying and discarding, buying and discarding. And that has a real impact on the footprint that we put on the earth, the material footprint that we put on the earth, both the CO2 footprint and also the materials footprint. And this is another way of looking at that data. This is material consumption per capita per day in different parts of the world. Each of these rucksacks here, they don't really look like rucksacks, but each of these little oval things represents 15 kgs, or about 32 pounds of resource consumption per capita per day. In the United States, the average person is consuming 88 kgs a day of resources. Now, you're not seeing it at the household level. Nowhere near that. You may be filling up a lot of garbage bags, and we talked about that in class today, but a lot of this is hidden to you because it's in the production system. So it's the material resources that are going into producing the things that we are consuming. And it's also what business is consuming and what government is consuming. So it's not all at the household level. But if you take the whole American economy, this is an enormous amount of resources. Because a lot of this production is really materials intensive. To make little gadgets like this requires thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of natural resources. And we don't see it, especially when it comes in these small electronics. But the mining that's going on for this, the water use, the sand to make cement and the glass and so forth. And what you see again here is that same story. We're double the Western Europeans who have, as I keep saying, comparable standards of living. So we've got to do something about that material footprint, about that consumption footprint. So there are a lot of really exciting new responses to what we might call this hyperconsumption, what some people have called hyperconsumption. The heavy consumption, particularly of the last 20 years. This is a group of a company called ThreadUp. It was actually started by a couple of Boston College students. And they were thinking about that picture I showed you at the beginning of this part of the talk, that woman with all those clothes in her room. And they were, for her, it's more like a 75%, or maybe it's a 90%. Because the clothes are not in her closet, they're on her floor. But you don't wear 25% of the clothes in your closet. Join ThreadUp and start exchanging them for some that you will. Now, if any of you remember the days when Netflix actually used DVDs and you put them in the mail and sent them back, for some of you, you may be young, we're on the pure streaming model mostly now, but ThreadUp became the Netflix of clothing. You could take those clothes you didn't want, you put them in an envelope, prepaid envelope, you put it in the the box, the mailbox. It gets sent to someone who wanted those clothes, and you get an envelope in the mail back of somebody else's clothes that they didn't want. So it's a kind of clothes swapping system. They eventually specialized in kids' clothes because kids outgrow their clothes a lot. It's easy to buy kids' clothes online. Parents aren't so picky. But it's a peer-to-peer, or what we call a collaborative consumption economy, in which we are recirculating those goods that still have usefulness. It's a way of getting access to new-to-you clothes with very few pennies. So it's good for a system, a world in which maybe your incomes aren't growing that much, but you still have consumer desires, and you want new clothes, and you want different clothes. So we are recirculating among this surfeit of goods that we have produced over the last couple of decades. And people call this collaborative consumption. We also call it the new sharing economy, and we're doing things like car sharing. And we're also revalorizing, or kind of remembering and making visible again old-fashioned forms of sharing that didn't go out of date, like didn't fall away, like tool libraries. We're in a community, a low-income community, where everybody can't afford to buy all those tools themselves. Someone in the community or a community group buys them, and people come and check them out of the tool library when they need to use them. So people can get all the uses out of these things that they need without us having to build and make so many of these tools. And we've got a lot more sophisticated ways of doing that. What's the fastest growing form of transportation in the world now? It's bike sharing. And I don't know if you've got a bike sharing program going here, but in Boston, they're proliferating. If you come to Boston, you'll see bikes all over the city and in Cambridge that you can take. You can use a credit card, you get the bike, you can use it for a while, you put it somewhere else, and pretty much wherever I'm going these days, not every place I go, but many of the places that I go, you find these bike sharing programs, and they've figured out how to make them work. The whole transportation sector is being transformed through vehicle sharing. The one you must have probably heard the most about is Zipcar, which is not a true sharing company because the company owns the cars. It's not a peer-to-peer sharing. But there are things like ride sharing, New Ride, Zimride, Go Loco. You need a ride to somewhere, real-time technology, these transponders in these cars and your iPhone. You can find out where somebody is who's driving to the place that you want to go, and they can find out about you, and they swing by and they pick you up. Or you can go to a peer-to-peer car rental site where you can rent your car out to other ordinary people, or they can rent a car from you. And the internet is really important here, both by making it really easy for people to connect up, but also because you have reputation systems on the internet that make it possible for people to find out about strangers. Am I really going to go into the car of a stranger to take a ride somewhere? Well, I might if I've read about all the other people who've gone into that person's car and had a great experience with them. And I can find out that they've been rated and vetted and they've done this 25 times and nobody's had any problems. Transportation is one sector. Lodging is another. This is Couchsurfing. Couchsurfing started as a nonprofit in which, through an online matching system, people could find people in other parts of the world or the country. But it was mostly used for international. And I gather you have a member of the Sociology department here who works on Couchsurfing, where people stay on other people's couches. And that was it's a free site. So people open their homes to travelers, they meet them, they really enjoy that connection. And then those travelers in turn do it to others, not obligated to do so, but that's a sharing of hospitality and lodging. And there are for-profit sites like this, Airbnb being the most well-known, where people are renting out their couches or their guest rooms. There are things like co-working, where people get together in a space, and rather than all renting separate offices, which is expensive, and particularly in startup culture or people who are working on their own, self-employed, consultants, part-timers, they go and they share the infrastructure of some coffee, and they share the infrastructure of internet and maybe some office help and so forth. And they're in a co-working space together, so we can save space, we can save on electricity. And we do something similar now with land. There's a group called Land Share, and there are other groups that are doing the same thing, that are putting people together who want a garden but don't have land with people who have land and don't know how to garden. And then they share the products from those vegetable gardens mostly, connecting growers to people with land to share. There's also a growing gift economy, Free Cycle being one of the first ones. You join a local Free Cycle community, and stuff you don't want you give away to the people in that community. You're also expected to take as a member of that community. So the idea is that you have a give and take of free items, changing the world one gift at a time, millions of items which have now been given away on Free Cycle. And this is a kind of Adam Werbach, who's a longtime environmentalist who went to work for Saatchi and Saatchi, started Yerdle, which is a kind of trendier, kind of more spiffy sort of Free Cycle, a magical place where people share things with friends. And here's, people are sharing a tent and so forth. So you want to go camping, you don't have to go out and buy all the camping equipment. You go on Yerdle and somebody's going to lend you a tent. So there's both sharing and giving in these sites. So this phenomenon sharing economy, collaborative consumption, I call it connected consumption, involves the sharing of assets, the swapping of goods. It's digitally enabled, as I said, deals with issues of trust and reputation. You have profit and non-profit versions. Zipcar, for example, just sold out. Highly profitable example. But you also have Couchsurfing, time banking, sharing economies, those tool libraries where no one's trying to make money. They're just trying to create new economies and new social goods. Some are explicitly articulating values of new economics. Some of them want to get really big. Others want to stay local. But they all share these features, a number of features around sharing, connection, and collaboration. I'm doing research on these for the MacArthur Foundation. I've been studying a time bank where people swap services. I've been studying open access learning where people are getting free access to online learning, things like MOOCs, the massively open online courses, and other kinds of free educational opportunities online. We've also been studying food swapping, which is another trend that's starting first in Brooklyn, and now we have in Boston a bunch of food swapping that's going on. So the last slide I want to show is the third piece of this. So I've talked about shorter hours, meaning people have more time outside their formal jobs. They get involved in this collaborative consumption as a way to get access to goods that's cheaper and low footprint, and I emphasized some of the carbon footprint aspects of some of these sharing things. And the last part of it is do it yourself, or what I call in my book, clunky term, high-tech self-provisioning. But if you're working fewer hours and you've got more time, you're doing some of this collaborative consumption, what we're finding is that many people are also getting involved in the provision of some of their basic needs on their own. So they may start to grow food. They may be building eco-homes with low footprints, and these are some of the examples. They may be generating energy off the grid in their own homes, or maybe they're selling it back to the grid. Here's a windmill. They may be putting solar panels on. This is a permaculture garden where they're learning how to do agriculture and agroforestry in ways that don't require as much human labor, that don't use chemicals, so they're low footprint in terms of resource intensity, but they're using biomimicry and other eco-knowledges to figure out how does nature do it so efficiently. And let's try and mimic our agricultural practices on nature. Let's take advantage of synergies of nature. Let's use chickens to weed gardens so we don't have to use fertilizer, and so forth. So permaculture is a form of agricultural food provisioning that uses lots of human knowledge. And then that's the sense in which it's high tech and not so much chemicals and carbon. And you've got this great DIY sort of low impact building work going on all around the country too, using locally appropriate materials. This is a fab lab. These were invented at MIT. You've probably heard of 3D printers. They're getting really popular now. But these are also high-tech ways for people to make things for themselves very cheaply. They use scrap plastics and metals. You can build phones with them. You can build bicycles. You can build prefab houses. You can build all kinds of things once you learn how to do it. And what these all together mean is that people will be able to provide for themselves in ways that require lots of human creativity and joy. The people who are doing these things are really enjoying them. They'll be able to provide for themselves in low carbon intensive, high satisfaction, low cost ways, both at a household level and at a community level. Many of these things are happening on a community basis. And put together with those shorter hours of formal work, new cultures of consumption, you can begin to create an economy in which people can live well, have livelihood, have low footprint, have high satisfaction, and have lots of community, and not have to make the trade-off between ecological survival and economic well-being. Thank you. Sorry, I went on so long.
So now we have a little bit of time for questions. So if anybody would like to ask Professor Schor a question or two?
Yes.
What can we do to change individual behavior so that people don't decide to overindulge themselves in like various goods?
Well, there are two parts to it. I mean, one is, I think it's hard to go against the tide of the way the economy is working. So to some extent, we got to think about more than just individual behavior. If you have a system that's sort of funneling money into people's pockets or funneling credit into people's pockets, kind of tisk, 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 don't consume that, is difficult. So that's why we need to talk about that path of the economy. That's number one. But number two, I think that the most effective way is for people, maybe like you, who kind of are interested in these ideas, who sort of think we really need to do something, to start modeling these new behaviors and participating in them and doing them in visible ways. Because one of the things about consumption that's really great from the point of view of trying to move to a different consumer culture, a different culture of consuming, we'll call it that, is that culture, consuming patterns spread person to person. And people start doing what they see other people doing. So you see some of these things are really taking off because people hear about them from their friends, or they see them in action, or people are writing articles about them. So I think promoting and making visible these new ways of being is really, really important. And so doing it yourself and getting your friends to do it is the first step towards getting other people to follow along. There is a way in which new practices, new economic practices come through bubble up. So, and that is what you are seeing with these consumer innovations, and I think we're also seeing it on the production side too, in terms of small scale production. So I think you're right that the big corporations are not going to be the place where the shorter working hours starts. They have a lot of resistance to it. But let's think about ways in which either people who have lost connection to big corporations and don't have those kinds of jobs, people who are involuntarily unemployed, people who may be leaving school and don't want to go into what I've called that work and spend economy, in which they're working those really long hours and leading lifestyles that are not necessarily so meaningful, and they're getting burned out if they can. Part of what I'm trying to do here is think about ways which we can begin to enable people to live these alternative lifestyles which have shorter hours of connections to, fewer hours of work in the formal economy. So that maybe you do take up a part-time job and you do some self-provisioning and you do some connected consumption. And we're seeing more and more young people who are living in these ways. We're interviewing them. They call themselves patchwork careers, putting together diverse streams of income rather than just thinking one high-paying job from a corporation and now I got to fight with that corporation over how many hours. So I think part of the strategy is to begin to bubble up some alternatives that start to look like feasible ways to live that are not, Exxon and Citibank. And then as we begin to get those models, start to push, create a political movement and a social movement that can create more policy change and more political change that both pushes the Exxons and the Citibanks to change, but also that makes this alternative new, more local, more small-scale economy more vibrant. So it's a kind of strategy of creating an alternative outside the boundaries of that formal economy. Yes?
Well, given our planet's current energy infrastructure, particularly in the States, many experts say that there is no viable replacement for oil and coal and our conventional fossil fuels. And I was just wondering if you agree with this statement, And if you don't, what are some viable resources that you think we can move to?
Well, what I would agree with is there's not one energy source or new energy technology that can do everything. I very much disagree with that point of view. And I also think that you need to look at who the people who are saying we've got to stay on fossil fuels are funded by, because a lot of them are funded by those companies. The idea that fossil fuels are inevitable, I think, is a really pernicious idea. So the answer, I believe, is in the combination of clean alternatives, so wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, etc. None of them are perfect. They all have negatives to them. The combination of that and, really importantly, restraining demand. I think the view that says we have to stay on fossils typically says let's just keep letting demand increase the way it is, and demand growth is inevitable. And you've got to take that on. That's why I'm talking about shorter hours of work. That's why I'm talking about a different kind of economy in which we're not just taking for granted the idea that we have to constantly be increasing our demand for energy in the way that we have been. So there are a lot of pretty cool examples of countries that are doing things differently. I mean, the Germans had I forget the exact percentage of their electricity powered by solar. I think last year there were a couple of days in the spring when they had something like, I don't know, was it 80% or what was it? What's that? Half of all their electricity use solar power. I mean, and we're just getting into this, so that's pretty remarkable. You have smaller countries which are going totally into renewables. So I think it's possible. What it requires is a big collective commitment, because you don't change energy systems piecemeal. The energy systems that we have today, the fossil fuel systems, were built through enormous government subsidies, enormous, and a commitment to these energy sources. And we're still paying out those billions and billions in energy subsidies to fossil fuels. So it's going to require a collective commitment to say we're getting onto a different energy path. And I think it's that combination of all the clean sources plus demand restraint. It's a great question. Yeah?
With a decrease in consumption due to do-it-yourself attitude as well as shorter work week, would that lower our GDP?
It could. It could. GDP is really complicated because it's probably not something. It's not the measure that we want to worry about, because think about it. We've got the anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon spill. That puts a ton of increase in GDP because all that cleanup gets counted in GDP and none of the damage gets counted in GDP. When you go from doing something for money, you and I might be I might be working for you, or we're exchanging money, something in money terms, that counts in the GDP. But if we decide to shift to one of these barter systems, it disappears from the GDP. The GDP, and there's a lot of great work that's been done on this. Professor Stiglitz from Columbia did a great report on the mismeasurement for the French government a couple of years ago. I forget the name of the report, but you can look, Sarkozy Commission. Nicolas Sarkozy commissioned it. The GDP is a really arbitrary measure of stuff that has increasingly diverged from well-being since the 1970s. So the questions we need to ask are, what would this do to our mental and physical health of our population? What would it do to our satisfaction indices? What would it do to our poverty rates? What would it do to our environment? Because all the things that we really care about, the things that GDP is supposed to be moving with and used to move with, but no longer does. So yes, it would lower GDP, but it might give more people livelihood. It might give more people real employment. It might reduce our poverty rate a lot. in the last couple of months especially, but in the last year, more and more attention paid to these collaborative consumption initiatives because they're starting to scale up, and they have originally were sort of growing up kind of adjacent to legal systems and kind of ignoring legal systems. So, for example, Airbnb, some of the people who are renting out in places like New York City are in, some of what they're doing is in violation. If you're renting out your own place, it's okay. But if you are subletting and you rent out, I think is what's going on in New York City, you're in violation. There's a question of paying taxes, because a lot of this is untaxed activity, because a lot of it's out of the market, or it's so small scale that it's not being taxed. The group of taxi drivers, or the taxi companies in Boston, just sued a company called Uber. Do you know what Uber is? So it's an online app to get idle vehicles in real time. It's a sort of taxi/limousine service, but they don't have medallions and they're not regulated by the same thing. So there's there are issues around the rental of the relay rides. If you rent your car to someone and they get into an accident, is your insurance obligated to pay? So the answer is lots of gray area right now, lots of conflict and sort of people contesting around this right now, and the person who's most expert on this in that collaborative consumption space is someone named Janelle Orsi, and she's a lawyer out of Berkeley, and she's written a book about this, and she's doing a lot on the legal aspects. Like any new economic forms, when they come up, they come up in the context of one set of regulations and taxation and so forth, and they end up, of course, they will generate new regulations and tax regimes, and all of that is very much in play right now. Yeah?
Based on your research, do you feel like organizations in the United States, like the EPA, are like doing enough to help the problem, or do you feel like, what's your stance on that?
The EPA was trying to regulate greenhouse gases, and the White House has not been supportive of that. And of course, you probably know if you follow this, that the last Congress did everything in their power to destroy the EPA, and the number of resolutions and hearings and so forth that they directed against the EPA was unprecedented. And there's great work you can find on the internet about this. So they are not doing enough. They're in a very difficult political environment. And I think that one of the things we need to do is, as citizens, put a lot more pressure on the government to push them to get the EPA to do what it is supposed to do, which is keep our air clean, for example. A really important development in climate politics and policy in the last little while has been the discussion of what are called co-benefits. So bringing together the environmental justice community, people who live in areas where the air is tremendously polluted and they have elevated rates of asthma, lung disease, cancer, and so forth because of the toxicity of that air, and bring that together with the climate community. Because cleaning up they tend to be climate hotspot, carbon hotspots, and you have both a public health perspective to this. There's an environmental racism perspective to this because they are disproportionately communities of color, and there's a climate impact. And so by bringing those together, that's one of the ways I think the EPA is going to be able to thread the political needle a little bit. That it's a new strategy. But we need to be putting more pressure on the president to do what he, I think, would like to do. But and he was talking about this at a fundraiser. The billionaire Tom Steyer, who's putting money into the Massachusetts Senate race. People know about this, trying to make climate one of the big issues, and it's controversial because it's big outside money coming into the state. He held a fundraiser for Obama the day after he did a big a big event here in Boston to sort of announce his role in this race. And Obama just said to him, I'm getting killed by the power of the fossil fuel lobbies. For me to be able to cancel the pipeline, or for me to be able to act on climate, I've got to get more support out there, more political mobilization. Yes, sir.
How would you introduce the idea of cutting back working hours and hiring new employees to fill those hours to the company?
Well, I call it the 80% solution, and it applies, let's say, to students who are graduating from college. And the idea is that you go to a company and you say, if it's got to be a company that's hiring, but so you could hire 4 employees at full-time salaries, full-time work, or you could hire 5 employees at 80% schedules and 80% pay. So they'd work 4-day work weeks. They'd only get 80% of what a full-time salary would be. You'd be doing a great service to this country because you would be helping to address the serious problem of youth unemployment, that we don't have enough jobs for our youth who are coming out of schools, whether they're high schools or colleges. And I think there's a patriotic or a nationalistic dimension to them. I would talk to them about what would you need to do to make this financially viable for you? And, one of the big issues there is going to be the benefits. How are the benefits going to be paid? And do they have to pay benefits for 5 people rather than 4, because that will cost them more? So how can the government chip in some of that as a part of the health care law? Could we get some new provisions there? Do the people get 80% of the benefits? Or, there are ways, could we get a tax credit for that? I've gone to companies over the years and talked to them about shorter hours and what some of the benefits are, and you do find companies that are open to these things. So I think that my first selling point would probably be on solving the problem of youth unemployment and the needs of the country. Yes?
On that same topic, you're a professor, correct?
Yes.
Going into next year, would you and would you urge yourself and your colleagues to only teach 80% of their classes and only receive 80% of your current salary?
There is a difference. So first answer would be yes. I mean, I'd be happy to do that if what the university committed to doing was hiring 20% more faculty. So that would be great. I would love that. We need more jobs for new PhDs because they're facing a terrible job market. The one thing I want to say about this is that if you look at the research on this, mostly from economics, but also psychology, asking people to reduce income that they already have is you could ask, it's very difficult to get them to do it. It's much easier to get people to accept. So that's why the 80% solution starts from people who are in school who have no income or low income. They're going to get an 80% increase. They're going to lose that, they might lose that extra 20%, but they never had it anyway. So it's easier for them to give that up. Also, for presumably what it's doing to them is it's reducing that 20% chance that they'll be unemployed, which is a really bad outcome. So I think it's easier to hire new people on that than it is to reduce. That having been said, it's also true that if you look at higher income, higher educated employees, they are more willing to make those trade-offs. And particularly before the downturn, we had a lot of people in this country who would have been willing to make time, money trade-offs. So that especially people like the 3-day weekend. So working a 4-day work week, giving up 20% of your pay, that's a deal many people would take if they could actually, if they really weren't going to have to work on that 5th day and so forth. So tenured professors are a group where I would be willing to try it because they fit into the category that would be most likely to do something like that. Oh, yeah.
What would be the best or most effective action that we could take as college students regarding climate responsibility and consumption?
Well, I think the first thing is to join some of the climate activist groups that have started. There's a new one that started Mass 350, which is affiliated with 350.org. They've got a big group going in Boston now, and they're doing a lot of work on Keystone XL. They're doing divestment, so fossil fuel divestment on college campuses. In terms of consumption, as college students, there's stuff you can do on campus, probably food, and beef and livestock consumption is an area where there's a big climate impact of changing consumption. We were also talking in Professor Jones's class today about some stuff we did at BC around dormitory overheating. I gather you guys have the same problem we do, which is like 70 or 80% of our students report overheating in the dorms and often have open windows. I mean, this is like, that's one of those areas I talked about how wasteful our practices are, where we're not even getting benefit out of all that carbon that we're putting in the atmosphere. So that's a sort of local, that's a campus thing, which is really oriented more toward this institution and the people in it. I do think the political struggle is really key. So I would urge you to get involved in a group called the Better Future Project, which is the founding group of Mass 350 Mass 350. I can never remember which. It's one of those two. Is there a chapter out here? I don't think so yet, right? Do you know of one? No, but it would be great to start a chapter. They're really going gangbusters, doing a lot of cool stuff. Yes?
I have two questions. The first is, a lot of the solutions that you presented at the end of the PowerPoint were sort of grassroots oriented and very individual oriented. And I guess my question would be, how many people would have to partake in these, and how many of these grassroots actions would have to occur in order to thwart this out of control climate change that you alluded to earlier? And then the second question is, we talked a lot about the government and putting pressure on the government to sort of switch the alternatives and also to give the EPA the power that they need to regulate greenhouse gas emissions and things like that. But I guess my question is, what role would the government play in helping to develop the kind of culture of consumer, the economy that you talked about, that doesn't permit people to overspend and sort of hinders their ability to overconsume? I guess it's just more like what role the government plays in the social aspect.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the reasons that people like me have started to look to grassroots solution is because our government is captured by special interests, and in this case, fossil fuel industry. And so it's been unwilling to make the kinds of changes that it needs to. That's less true at the state level. In some states, like this state, has been pretty good on clean energy and so forth. So the role of the grassroots alternatives is not, I don't think about it in, what I call the simple accretion model or the simple aggregation model. It's not because individuals making these changes are going to just add up to the whole system change. It doesn't happen that way. That's a naive model of political change. And by the way, it's not, and I apologize if I gave this impression, it's not just individuals and households, it's people also acting in community. I think the way it can happen to be successful is where you have both the local communities and then importantly cities, which come together around some of these innovations, and they start to foster these innovations, and you get policy at a city level that makes it more feasible for people to live in these alternative ways. And then you start to build up, you have two things that happen. One is you have the demonstration effect. So people are seeing, wow, it's possible to live differently. And so the colonization of the imagination, which has happened in the business as usual economy, the idea that there is no alternative, that we have to do what Exxon and Citibank tell us. So that hold gets weakened. And also, as you start to build some critical mass places, they figure out what policies they need and what they need to push for from local, state, and federal. And so it's a political strategy, not just a sort of simple vote with your dollars and the system's going to change through atomistic individual consumer activity. I don't believe that's the way things change, but I do believe that people living the changes they want to see is an important part of building a movement for social transformation. Thank you. Thank you.